So when Johnny asked me to kind of come and talk tonight, he said he wanted to kind of look at all of the big trends that are kind of happening in business. We've just finished this really cool study that I'd shared with him of 11 countries around the world, thousands of respondents about where sport kind of fits, and soccer/football is a big theme in there that we're going to kind of go through. So my plan is, and I'm going to, hopefully you can buckle in because there's a lot of stuff, and they gave me an hour, and as a good academic, I'm going to take an hour and go through it all. So just to say a bit about myself, other than being kind of the volunteer team manager for my kids play for, my twin boys play for FC Rockwood, U10. Other than that, and being a bad soccer player myself, I don't have a lot of specific soccer background, but I have a lot of research I've done in sport as a whole. Profitability, clubs, Europe, North America. I've written a lot of books. I've worked in lots of places, been at lots of universities all over the place. I'd like to put this up. That's my life kind of in a slide. I was an athlete and continue to do a bunch of things. I've been to 5 Olympic Games and 2 Paralympic Games. Was the deputy chef of the Canadian team at the 2016 Paralympic Games. Do a lot of consulting with the T1 agency that you might know. And I'm currently at the University of Guelph, where we've got an institute that looks at sport business. So just to give you an idea, I've got a bit of a background, and you can check me out if you want to ask any other stuff. So what are the plans for tonight? One, we're going to share a ton of information, local, global, etc. A lot of this stuff, as I said, is right off the press, really interesting. I'm going to try to then adapt it into stuff that you can take away for your academy, your club, your PSO. A lot of you are struggling in a lot of places to generate resources, to find talent, to keep kids and boys and girls in your sport. These kind of things are common across all sports in Canada. I'm going to integrate a lot of that stuff in there. We're going to then try to adapt a lot of these things specific to soccer, so what we know around us, into soccer. Then I'll give you some thoughts on ideas and tactics at the end around 3 things. One is where we kind of fit in the global scheme. 2, around generating resources, sponsorship, dollars, in-kind, charity supports, etc. for your organization. And then last, about that retention and attraction factor of young people to our sport, which is a huge brewing problem in Canada. And soccer hasn't been hit as hard as others, but I'm going to show you some data that shows it's coming. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go through a bunch of different studies and a bunch of background and share it with you, and then try to build it into some commentary and some specific recommendations. So this is where a lot of the information comes from. I've written 10 books. I've got hundreds of publications, got all this kind of stuff out there. Going to draw on a lot of different things to pull onto this. Here's some big government grants we've done around urban Canadian youth, some of the consulting experience. The Canadian Sponsorship Landscape Study is a study we've been doing for 14 years. We're about to go out again. So we have 14 years of data of sponsorship in Canada. This is my friend Adam Mitchell. I put his name up there because he and I have partnered on this big global study that I'm going to share at the end that's got some amazing data that Johnny really liked when we kind of got this going. So a bunch of stuff's going to lead us into this. And then I broke it into 5 topics. So this is the 5 things I'm going to go through. I won't list them now, and at the end I'll kind of pull it all together with some summary stuff. Kind of goes from local to global, and I kept the global stuff at the end because it's pretty cool and pretty neat. So what are we facing today with generating resources in sport in Canada, right? There's a lot going on. It's challenging. There's a lot of competition. And these are some ideas, some background that can kind of lead us into this. So I'm parking things like government funding, sanctioning dollars, right? These things you guys know, that's not my area. We're talking about things where we can generate dollars outside of that. So here's a little chart I like to show. This is from one of our books that shows you've got more than just sponsorship. And sponsorship is a highly misused word, especially in minor sport and small sport organizations. Most of what we get actually falls over here. In one of those books I showed you, we proposed this new topic, which has done really, really well. And then at the far end, you get these amazing partnerships. And we just had someone from FIFA, Victor, on stage, right? They're at this level. Few of us are down at the other end. So this is, at this end of the spectrum, is when someone gives an anonymous donation, right? Gives money and doesn't want anything in return. You've probably maybe done that in your life. Donated to a cancer foundation, didn't ask for anything back. That is pure philanthropy. That's awfully rare in the corporate world, right? If not, non-existent these days. The other end, you've got this perfectly symbiotic relationship. Coca-Cola and the Olympic Games. Budweiser in the NFL, where they just, I say one, Gatorade and Ironman triathlons. They just fit together, right? Boom, boom, boom. Then everything in between goes from where it's purely a business decision, and these kind of things where organizations give, but they expect some credit, and then this kind of in-between piece, which I'll talk about before. So what can we do to try to drive what we're doing to get more resources into our organization? So what's happening with sponsorship in Canada? A little bit of just pure marketing background. As you know, when you try to do something that's marketing, you're trying to achieve some kind of outcome. So when an organization is sponsoring you, they're trying to get somebody to click, buy, enter, walk, taste, trial, drive, whatever it is, their products. We're talking about business decisions, not donations. Sponsorship is one of many things these organizations can do, right? They can buy ads, they can lower their price, they can do a PR campaign. You're not the only thing on their list when they're thinking about what they want to do. The best way to think about sponsorship and how it works, and when it really works, and there's tons of research on this, and we've done lots of it, is around the idea of transferring images. It's a great example. So Kia, about 10 years ago, maybe 15 now, had a reputation as what? It was a Korean car, pretty junky, right? Low priced. Who would want one except it was cheap? Does that hold today? Absolutely not. And one of the things they've really done in North America is they've partnered with elite brands, sporting brands. They've done the NFL, they've been involved with Olympic associations, high-end brands that have these great images. We then, through that sponsorship, transfer those images across, and our view of the brand changes, right? So image transfer is often how we best describe how sponsorship really, really works, right? So it's an interesting kind of thing. So I'm going to draw on this study, the Canadian Sponsorship Landscape Study. All of this data is online for free if you ever want to get it and download it. We do it in English and in French to talk to you a little bit about it. It's a study we collect from Canadian brands, sponsors, Canadian events, properties that collect the money, and the agencies that kind of make that happen between the two. Lots and lots of data. Over the last 13 years, we've got about 4,000 Canadian responses that I'm going to draw from when we go forward. There's tons and tons of data out there you can grab from the website if you're interested, or just send me a note and I'll share whatever you would like. But what was neat in 2018, and you know with longitudinal studies, they're exactly that. They go on for a long time. So I do this every year, you analyze it, and last year was like, wow, we saw an amazing shift for the first time in what's happening in Canada. So sponsorship has evolved. It's got much more sophisticated. It's grown. There's a whole bunch of reasons, and I'm going to give you quickly 6 of them to give you some of the things we want to do. I know that's not 6, that's 11. There are 11 main ones in the study. I'm going to talk about 6 of them. So here's the first thing that's kind of happened. So the industry has hit $3 billion. So we estimate now that Canadian brands are spending $3 billion on sponsorship. I'll explain in a second. That's not irrelevant to you if you're a smaller property. Big growth rate. What's interesting is we kind of look at the overall spend that brands do. Here's what they're spending on rights fees, and here's what they spend on activation. So activation is what they spend in addition to that fee they give you to make it happen. And we've always trailed other countries behind, but we saw this really nice thing where activation has gone up and rights fees are relatively flat. So our sponsors are getting more sophisticated, would be the bottom line, and they're spending lots of dollars. We've seen this, we called it in 2014 Pro Sports Renaissance. These are the different categories: pro sport, amateur sport, festivals, cause, and the arts. If you're adding them up, they don't add to 100 because there's a whole bunch of other little ones like education, festivals, etc., that aren't on this list. So there's a bunch of other categories. But pro sport has just had this massive increase. Not hard to see, right? Look what the CFL's doing. MLS taking a whole pile of money. The NHL has totally gone away from rink boards. They're doing Stanley Cup, Winter Classics, all this stuff. The money is flowing back to professional sport. You can go into the CFL and what they're doing, etc. So we're seeing our biggest competition now, if you're in the amateur sector, is coming from professional sport. The third thing that we saw, which is really interesting, is this idea of a cause. And all of us in small sport, we all think we have a great story. We have the best reason to give us some money. Our athletes are the most important. Our kids are cool, etc., right? But everybody's got these kind of things. So we said, let's dig in and figure out, with a cause, how important is it? Because we've always had this underlying belief in sponsorship that there has to be a cause, either direct or indirectly associated with a property for a brand really to get excited about you. And in fact, whether that's changed or whether we were misreading it, it's not the case at all. So sometimes they tell us it's very important, but very rare, less than 1 in 10. And sometimes a brand will tell you, I don't care about causes at all. I'm trying to sell more chocolate bars, whatever the case may be. Impact-oriented, 22%. So is what I'm doing going to help that cause? So brands are telling us, if we really care about soccer or kids soccer or Paralympic sport, how can I achieve that with my sponsorship? But the biggest one, as kind of you might expect, is it going to help me drive my business objectives? If that cause is relevant, yes. If it's not, I'm going to move on, right? So it's a very different approach. So cause is no longer thought of as something you should have. It's something you need to be strategic about, if that makes sense. And that's a big shift in our thinking, and we're writing about that academically too. Number 4, I mentioned the growth and activation. So this is very exciting. I was going to fall off the stage. Very exciting as we go up. And now you're seeing about $1.2 billion spent in activating sponsorships in this country every year, not just the 1.8 that we see overall. Another big shift we saw that was quite interesting was a return, and this is good for small properties, to experiential stuff. So for many years, we'd seen social media been the driver of ROI from activation. This idea of branded content, creating your own events, your own online platforms. Bud Bowl would be an example, et cetera, that you could look at to do different things. We saw this come back to the top of, we got to get people there, like this conference, talk to each other, have some food, connect with our stuff, and let's get them to get in our truck and drive it around at the halftime show. Let's get them to try our new brand, our new taste, our new whatever the case may be, our new flavor as we go. Let's get them to work, try our game, download our app, whatever the case may be. This is what's really driving the top, is experiential. And I'm just grabbing a few examples from my consulting life. You can see the kind of things that are really tracking and really working. And these are some of the things that win awards at the Sponsorship Marketing Council of Canada. The 6th one, I saved this one to last. This is very important for small properties like you. As we saw this real shift in, we call it kind of a bimodal distribution. So you're saying, yeah, whatever, Dr. O'Reilly, Norm, you're talking about the Leafs and the Habs and the Canadian Olympic Committee, et cetera. Yes, at one end we are, and that's this end. This is these big national global. So that percentage of the pie, the reach of these sponsorships is going up. But what is going down is not good for the Ontario Soccer Association, but provincial, multi-provincial, and regional, what's going up is local. So brands are spending in 2 ways, trending up. One is properties that allow them to reach all Canadians or beyond Canada in a really high-reach kind of way, or they're investing very specifically on things that are grassroots, where people can touch, where people can feel, where you can really directly reach people in this cluttered, hyper-screen world that we live in. So very, very positive when you're thinking about going forward that way. I mentioned that activation is key. This is my favorite example. If you're ever looking for a sponsor and you're dealing with a sponsor and say, what kind of activation? Kraft Hockeyville is an absolute total home run. It's won awards all over the world for what it does. And basically, it's an investment by Kraft, as you might know, to bring a local community an investment to help improve the arena. This is one of the years they won, so this big award. This is it's older, but the data went public. It's similar every year. They get 17 million Canadians to vote. 37,000 Canadians sit on a volunteer committee to try to get their town to win. Do you think that helps Kraft's brand? Do you think when they go to the grocery store, they put Kraft out of their brands into their shopping cart? Absolutely. It's a total off-the-charts home run. So think about what you can do for your brand. So here's some of the stuff that we're going to start pulling in from the big study from IMI. So activation is all these things that you can do to help your partner achieve what they want to do. So get them engaged, involved. Do they have a chance to win tickets? Can you impact the cause? Whole bunch of really positive kind of things. Get some quick hits of numbers here. This is brand new data, right off the presses, right? Early 2020. So 66% of Canadians have made an action on a brand due to a sponsorship. So about 7 in 10 of us have done something. We spent some money, we made a donation, we joined a website because of something a sponsor did around a property we like. 59% of us say something that a sponsor did in this country in the last month led us to change a purchase pattern. We may have bought a different car, or we thought about getting a different pair of pants or a different dress or signing up for a different whatever it was. So a lot of positive data. And the last thing it kind of shows what are the most effective things within that work. And again, this backs up that really experiential thing. People want to get access to stuff, to do things, to experience things. Experiential marketing has really risen in this age of super screens, which is kind of interesting, and we'll talk a bit about that as we kind of go forward. So here's how IMI, who's our partner on this, kind of pulls all this together. As you start getting down the line, you see the impact on purchase patterns and branding, et cetera, continue to go up. And I was trying to think of an example, and I sent Bjorn a note this morning. He said, hey, can I use this conference? Because he'd sent me this thing. We did a presentation at the SMCC a couple of weeks ago. And here's a conference, right? This is a relatively small event by a provincial sport organization in a very big sport, right? And look what they've done. This is last year's conference, and Ben talked a bit about it, I think, at the introduction, but sponsors are engaged. There's online platforms. There's places for things to meet. How many people are following through on sponsors? How many did something? Really, you can take something of this scale and scope. We don't have television. We don't have big streaming, and you can be in a very effective platform to drive things for your partners and, in turn, generate resources for your organization. He said, yes, I could use it. So hopefully he's okay with that still. All right, so then I want to say this PPP thing, and I want to talk a bit about this. This is this public-private partnerships. This is something I think a lot of you can think about. So public-private partnership historically is between a municipality and a private sector organization. So they were very common around the Vancouver 2010 Olympics. A lot of you might remember. The Sea to Sky Highway, classic, right? So some private organizations give a city a deal. They work together. That's what it was. Well, we said, let's try to apply this same notion to things like sport and physical activity and other causes. The idea being, think back to that 5 bubble thing I showed earlier. This is the case where sometimes a brand will give you some resources when they want some marketing return, but it's not the #1 objective, and they're also happy to help a cause. So you're pulling them away from doing this. And so it's an interesting thing. Think of something like the Canadian Paralympic Committee, right? Great example. So on one end, can the Canadian Paralympic Committee ever compete with the Olympics or FIFA and a pure sport? No, never, right? On the other end of the spectrum, can they ever compete with cancer in terms of a cause? Never. But you've got this nice spot in between, right? We've got a little bit of both, and how can you make it both work? So this started with some work with Participation, who helped us kind of pull it forward, and this idea of conceptualizing. We got a grant from a conference, and we pulled together these guidelines that some of you and a lot of people have kind of used. Why does it work? Well, a lot of times people like us think about the brand or the donor as somebody who just gives us money. They can give us so much more. So Participation has got this great partnership that's been on and off with Coca-Cola. Now, the biggest thing they get out of it, they get some money. But Coca-Cola has 300,000 people, if you consider delivery people, bottlers in this country. So if they're on side with a cause that they're associated with, that's better reach than Participation could get ever. They get a $100 million grant and they can't buy that reach, right? So these partners, they bring their marketing teams. I'll show the Homeless World Cup in a second. Nike helped the Homeless World Cup, which a lot of you probably know being in soccer. When I discovered that event and we wrote a Harvard case about it, it's extraordinary, right? It's using soccer to get people that are homeless back into real life. Nike found it. They gave a little bit of money, but you know what they gave them? They gave them their marketing department. How good of a gift is that? Nike's marketing department. Think you can do a couple things with that? Absolutely. So you're drawing in a lot of resources from different places. So here's our way to kind of conceptualize it. So it can be sport or any kind of cause, and you've got this mixed benefit of a marketing outcomes and a charity outcome, right? So that's very, very important. What's really also important is this notion of a disconnect. So when these things are really, really successful, it's when there is a disconnect. So in one of the interviews we asked Coca-Cola, well, when you're doing this with Participation, why don't you use Dasani water or Minute Maid orange juice? And their answer is, and rightly so, they don't need that. They're already thought of as healthy. We want to connect our brand, all of our employees, all of our program portfolios with that cause, right? And you can think about many companies have done that across the board, and I'll show you some examples in a second. So I'm going to go fly through these. There's one, right? Little disconnect. Here's another one. Another one. Pretty interesting partnership, right? You can see what's coming to the table. There's the one I just talked about. There's another really, really famous and really, really good one. This one, maybe the disconnect's a little left, depending how a little closer, depending how much you think that's healthy or not. But they're paying a premium for this. Now, each of these organizations has to make the decision, this is part of the guidelines, whether you enter into these things. So in the old days, this could be something like, would you take money from a tobacco company, right? That's the kind of thing you're talking about. But if you're comfortable with it, there's a premium to be made, and these smaller properties generate lots of stuff. There's a quick dive into some of the things you are thinking about in generating resources. Okay, number 2, they get shorter, kind of, as we go along. So this was, I kind of did some reflecting on, because Johnny asked me to kind of think about what are the big things that are happening in Canadian sport today that could be important in soccer. And I came up with 12. One of the key things I think is really important, I've done some of these before, it's an adapted version, is the idea of engagement. So we have a problem in sport that we're losing people. And I use engagement because engagement includes spectatorship, volunteerism, participation, the whole scope of how we can play around with engagement, and it's a very important thing. This is what we want, right? We want highly engaged fans, and we want that's my son, two twin boys on their team, and highly engaged players, right? That's all they want to do, they love it, that's what they want to play. So I grabbed some stuff from our book. So engagement, as I mentioned, is a holistic concept. You can engage by spectating, participating, actively and passively, like a lot of you do as coaches or administrators, or I do as the volunteer team manager. And then you can do it directly or indirectly. Very important point, and I make this everywhere and people don't like it, and a lot of people do advertising campaigns against it. There is zero relationship between participation and spectatorship. So if you're thinking about those things in different ways, you're doing it right. If you're thinking about them as leading to each other, it's totally wrong. There's no evidence that one leads to the other. People have been trying forever to show a connection between hosting the World Cup or hosting the Olympic Games and getting more kids to play sport. It's not there. But that's because it's a negative thing. What is there is it gets people interested. They might start to spectate. They might volunteer. People that do both in any sport that follow are that. I'll give you a great example. So the National Football League, the Super Bowl, by far the most watched television program in North America every year. How many of those people ever played serious tackle football? Less than 1/1000%. Similarly, go down, I run marathons, I'd be one of these people. Go down to the finish line of the Toronto Marathon, the 27,000 people that go across, ask them to name one of the medalists from the last Olympics in the marathon, and you'd be lucky if 1 in 100 even remembers that it was in the Olympics, the marathon, let alone know the person's name who won, right? So you're dealing with these very different things as you kind of go forward. Other very important point, and this has really been driven now by the technology age, so you all know this, but we used to be limited very much to what happens at the game or the event. Now, we have this stuff outside. I'm going to show you some data in a second that's the most powerful and the most followed events in the world are ones that don't actually happen very often. They build all their stuff around outside of game time. So what can you do? There's a whole bunch of stuff you can do, and I'm happy to share it more with you. I'm going to go through it very, very quickly. But we talk about these as platforms. There's different things you can use to engage people in your sport. And I'm going to talk a couple of them briefly, but there's a lot of these that are coming, that are growing, that are new, that are different. The sport itself, think about the 24-second clock and the three-point line. The growth of Champions League like 30 years ago from an average event to the number 2 highly valued sport property in the world. Think what baseball does with all of its content. It's a dying sport. It's got aging fan bases, yet it's at the pinnacle it's ever been at financially. Its owners are making fortunes. Its players are making fortunes because it's got tons and tons of content. Think of what happened in the NHL strike 10 years ago. They went from most of the teams losing money. Now it's down to a handful losing money. They're revenue sharing because they changed the game and the sport. You know this, the power of these teams globally. Other sports just don't do what soccer does. Build a fan base, have fan club members in countries you're not in. We don't do that in North America. We can talk about any player you want. It's leveraging it. Sponsorship and advertisers. So I'll slow down on this one. This is important. This is from the Laver Cup. And when you see those brands in the background, what do you think when you see Rolex and Mercedes and Credit Suisse and all their sponsors that they promote? That immediately sends a notion of, wow, this is a big-time event. This is a high-class event. I bet you there's wealthy people sitting in the crowd. I bet you the players make lots of money. Use your sponsors back. We showed Bjorn's little slide earlier, like they would use you. Gambling is massively on the rise. This just came out yesterday, so I plopped it in. IEG's new report of the NFL's sponsorship growth. Gambling, whether you like it or dislike it or love it or hate it or lost your mortgage from it, it's here. And it's coming, and it's a big part of sport, and it's a huge lever to get people interested and engaged in your game, even though there's very bad things about it. And then the new stuff that's coming, esports, we talk a lot about. We just finished a book on esports. It's growing, it's massive. There's this study just came out that in the United States and China of men between 20 and 29 who are not college educated, 20% of them are choosing not to go to work and to stay at home with their parents. And those that are working are choosing to work 20% less. 75% of the time they're playing video games. But you know what's interesting about it? You'll go, they are infinitely happier than they were before. They're healthier than they were before. They're doing more exercise. They're eating better. So there's these whole interesting notions. A lot of us in traditional sport have this icky about esports. But it is coming, and you need to integrate it, and it should be part of what people do and we want to see. Fantasy sports, a big one. There's some numbers in North America. It continues to grow. These are the number of North Americans, not including Mexico, who regularly play fantasy sports. It continues to rise. So integrating that digital stuff is becoming very, very, very important. I know I'm going through a lot of stuff. So when you're thinking about getting somebody to participate in your sport, as an athlete, could be a young boy or girl, could be a high-performance athlete you're trying to get to stay in and not quit and get a job, could be trying to recruit volunteers. It's a really complicated decision. People have a lot of things they can choose to do with their time and a lot of different options, and that's kind of the other thing. So now I'm going to rip through my 12 things to kind of take away, so hopefully you find these very useful. So one, we're dealing with this inactivity crisis. So I've hinted at this before, but Canada is now the worst or at the bottom of every country in the world in terms of physical activity. We're at the bottom. Now, good news is all the other G20 are also really bad. Sweden, which we used to say was really good, is bad. Australia is bad. Nobody's doing physical activity. About 1/3 of our people under 19 do what we would consider enough to stay healthy, and about 1/10 of people over 19 do enough to stay healthy. Like, we're into massive problems for our public health care system we can't even imagine down the road unless we kind of fix this. It's worse in populations that are female, and any really disadvantaged group, it kind of drops. But men are bad too. So we really have this massive inactivity crisis. So you say to me, what about these sports? What about the CrossFitters? And those psychopathic Ironman triathletes like me? That's what I do, right? Well, we're a little bit of the population. So there's 3 or 4% of us that are spending a fortune. We're spending a fortune. So your Canadian Tires will say, hey, we're doing all right. That's because there's these idiots that spend all their discretionary money on sport. But across the board, we're on this massive decline, right? And a lot of people buy equipment and stuff that they never even actually use. So here's Participaction's annual Active Healthy Kids Canada report card. If you talk to the lead author, he'd tell you we had to put a D+ on there because of political pressures. Really should have gotten an F. Here's the US data. There's 30 countries participate or so in this study now. Here's the things that drive it. So one thing that's really hurt is no one does anything but take a bus or drive to work or school anymore. Very few people do it. It's dropping in the schools. People have a lot of screen time and sedentary behaviors. Sport is the one place, the US is a C-, Canada's actually a B. So some of us are doing really good jobs at actually keeping some people active. And then a lot of, this is mostly in the cities, and a lot of you probably live in cities where it's just too expensive to keep parks or build a new arena or a new soccer field versus someone putting up a condo or something, right? So we're dealing with these big kind of challenges. So what's going to happen? Well, we're going to lose participants and fans. And there's a lot of this competition for kids going on. I've had, my youngest two are crazy, and I get stuff from clubs that say, hey, you've got to sign this form that says your kid won't play a different sport. Like, are you freaking kidding me? And I just rip it up. But I'm smart enough to rip it up. I'd say I'm an idiot enough to, whatever. But a lot of people don't, right? Like, this kind of thinking is crazy. So we've got all this competitiveness for kids going on, pushing it, and it drives them away, as I'll show you in a second, even if they're really, really talented from sport. Now, is there a silver lining? Sure. Government and healthcare people. I'm actually doing a talk for the Empire Club in a couple of months, and the whole thing they want me to talk about is around, can sport save public healthcare? If you read Fraser Institute reports and think tanks, they believe our healthcare system is cooked. We're already the least efficient in the world, and it's going to get way worse with this inactive population, right? So can sport and physical activity play a role there? Soccer, be one of them, is part of it. So there could be some pros for us. So don't be too lost with the negativity. So what will it mean to us? So I like this slide. I've showed it a few times. There's our famous, very simple athlete development model, and there's where it's going to go. Oh, I was trying to go backwards. Hold on. Like that. So you have less kids to pick from, less people that want to participate, less people paying fees, less parents involved. This is a concern, a massive concern. And your sport, because it's been cheaper and more open and easier to play and very popular, is one of the few that hasn't been hit very hard yet. I'll give you some data from some others in a second. So the second piece in that that's hurting us is our demographic shifts. We also have a lot less young people. If we didn't have immigration in the country, we'd have nobody left doing anything, right? Immigration is buoying up our population because Canadians are not having children. I have 4, so I'm one of the rare people that actually do. So here's the things that are driving our population forward. And everyone's moving into these urban environments. That's where young people want to live. They don't want to live in the country. They want to live everything easy to access. Rural universities are struggling. Urban universities are booming. Down the list we kind of go. Here's some interesting stuff. So this is from a Stats Canada deep dive on our young people a couple of years ago. And you'll notice, so this is low income to high income. So 55 and plus, if you're still active, it's usually because you have lots of money. And you can see, and that kind of goes across. And then, but if you're younger, it doesn't seem to be a big issue. So that's a really nice thing to see. But then this decline, and you can see the numbers, they've come down since then of where they are. And then visible minorities, obviously a huge trend that we're seeing as well. So I wanted to illustrate this, and I thought, well, how could I do this? I got this neat call this summer. Johnny, you'll probably remember this. I had a neat call this summer from a guy at Canadian Tire in Montreal. And he said, it was all in French. He said, Dr. O'Reilly, he said, I was at one of your presentations. So I presented at the Molson Canadian International Hockey Summit at the Bell Centre in Montreal about 10 years ago. And they asked me, Hockey Canada asked me to kind of forecast, because they wanted to get this, they knew this was coming, what the numbers would look like. And he said, I was at that conference and I just pulled out your numbers. I now work for Canadian Tire. He used to work for Hockey Quebec. And he said, you were right. It's like, what? He said, your projections, they were right. So how cool is this? So I got to brag about myself. But here's what I kind of presented. It's in French. But here's what I presented at that conference then. So here you can see, this is Canada. This is the total number of kids in Canada. And the numbers we'd figured out that we're going to be playing hockey because of this gradual decline in both population and interest, and then estimating where the numbers would go. So it went from 577 down to 419 boys. And this is actually what's basically kind of happened. And then here was in Quebec, so from 103,000 down to 79, it was almost bang on. So the math was good, and you can see the numbers going down, population overall. And then I did it, he asked me to do it again. So I extended it to 2033 with all the different factors. And you can see over that period, and hockey in Quebec would just be one example. We could use many from Canada. It's gone from 103,000 to 76,000 in that 33-year period. So that's the kind of trends, soccer being a bit buffered, that a lot of sports are dealing with. Number 3, so they're going to get faster, I promise. So this is one, I love this picture. So this is the Yankees and the Red Sox, right? Second inning or something, 4th inning, 1-0. This guy's asleep. They're not watching. This guy's on his phone. She's telling a joke. I don't know what this guy's doing. So this is the kind of thing. People don't really pay attention. So we've got this massive changing in generations. And this is really important for those that are older in the room, Gen X's like me, or if there's boomers in the room. So our young people now, so I have kids in 2 of these groups, but the next gens, the Gen Zs, right, up here, they have the same attention span as a goldfish. That's what they say, 8 seconds. Boomers' attention span is 2 hours. So the boomers in the room are like, Norm, we're just getting going. Keep going, baby. 1 hour is not enough. The Gen X's in the room are like, you're perfect. Good hour. Go get them, Norm. The millennials are like, when's this fool going to be done? I got to get out of here. And then these people already left. So, but unless you keep them entertained, right? So I have to do this in my teaching. You can see I'm trying to keep you entertained. You try to keep people entertained because it's not that they're not focused. It's that they're easily distracted, and it's hard to keep their attention, and they're massive multitaskers. So we're seeing these massive shifts in generations. The other thing we're seeing, and this is very important for those that don't think people are different, millennials and next gen, so those that are like, this is Tom Brady down to people that are about 20, and people that are under 20 are apples and oranges. So they're extremely different. I'll let you read those, but they're extremely different. So if you're dealing with a 15-year-old and a 27-year-old, and you're thinking them in the same way, you're making a huge mistake, whether it's work and HR, personal, family, etc. They're very, very different. So one thing we really have to do with young athletes, and I'll say this at the end, is get into their heads. Think like they do. Keep them interactive like they do. Change the way we coach. Change the way we run. Don't have people waiting in long periods of time with nothing to do. All these kind of things that we dealt with kids that they don't want to deal with. So what's going to happen? Esports got to integrate it, got to figure it out. Whether you believe it's a sport or not, that's totally irrelevant. Park that. Esports is something you have to engage and adopt because that's what young people, particularly boys, love to do. So make it part of their sport experience. Shorter events. I was at Notre Dame and I suggested that the baseball team should go to 3 innings. They didn't like it very much. The F1, I suggested maybe we should have the Daytona 50, not the Daytona 500. But these are the kind of things we got to think about, right? Baseball did all that effort to cut out the intentional walks. It saved them 15 minutes, right? You got to get them shorter if you want those people. Festivalization, we kind of coined this term in sponsorship. This conference is a good example. Turn anything you do into a festival atmosphere. You know that 8-second goldfish thing? Ever gone to a music festival with young people? It's gone. They're engaged. They'll stay there for 24 hours. Everything they do on their phone has to do with their experience. Turn it into a festival if you can. And then this last one, video. So people like me, when I open like the Globe and Mail, I read the text, right? Anyone here else in the room over 42? You read the text. Everybody else under 42, most of you watch the video. So you got to go to video content if you want to engage these young people. All right, I'm going to go through this one quickly. Channel exposure and revenue shrinkage. We have this problem that's not been that bad so far, but that sport in Canada and the United States has been formally based on this model of broadcasters, networks, and all these money changing hands. Those of us at the end of the day that love sport, spending $250 a month on our cable. Finally, we can now access this stuff direct. And if you're like me, you've probably cut your cable, and you're now just buying the sport products that you love, because that's what I watch, and my bill has gone to 1/3 of what it used to be. I don't watch commercials anymore, and I love it, right? But my kids have never been part of this. This is what they're part of. So over the top, direct to consumer, whatever you want to call it, it's chopping money. So you say, well, that's not happening yet. And you're right, not yet. But let's look at the 2 biggest properties, television-wise, in the world that are regular. The NFL. So look at their growth. This is in billions, right? So this is their dollars. Huge growth, flat. This is the Premier League. First time ever, last contract, they signed for less. So $300 million less, and they gave away basically the same amount of content. There's less people watching. People are cutting cable. They have to figure out different ways to do it. People are going to start spending more per content, etc. This is coming, and it's going to be interesting for sport. Because we were getting a lot of money in the past from people that don't watch sport, because everybody was paying for it. So TSN or Sportsnet are around $9 a month on a cable package. The Food Network is 1 cent, right? So most of the money is going to sport. You do the math. So TSN's gone from about 11 million subscribers down to 8, 3 million times how many months in a year? 12, 36 million times, let's round up, $10 a month. You do the math. $360 million a year that they were used to be getting, they're not getting anymore, right? And we all feel that everywhere. So this is what's going to go on and what's kind of happening. I'll be quick here. This is my family at a Notre Dame football game. Cost me about $1,000. That's my basement. Oh, wait, no, that's the basement I want. That's closer to what mine looks like. But that's still a more comfortable place to be, right? So we're fighting against that all the time in the ticket sales kind of word. This is what I talked about earlier, number 6. This is huge for you guys, huge. So we did this big study, multiple-year study of Canadian youth, 12 to 17 in Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. And these kids, so we interviewed them, their activity levels, about what they do, what they don't do, why they started. So 62% of them started sport not to make the Olympics, not to be like Michael Jordan or Messi or Ronaldo, but to have fun, to be with their friends. Fun, fun, fun. So, but why do they stop? Is it because they're not going to make the Olympics? Less than 1%, right? Is it because they're not going to become a superstar and a celebrity? Less than 1%. Is it because they're not going to go pro? Less than 1%. Why do you think they stop? Just where I started off, right? It's not fun anymore. It's no longer fun. I have this great story. My daughter, she's 17, so she's hitting this. I'm fighting to keep her active. All this data I read is now coming to life. But so she tried out for the field hockey team. She got a bunch of her friends together, and they went and tried out for the field hockey team at high school. And one of their friends, she's this unbelievable natural athlete. And the coach ranked her number 1. Said, this girl's amazing. She's going to be my best player. And my daughter and the 4 other girls that were her friends didn't make the team. So what do you think the girl that was number 1 ranked did? She quit. She's not there to be a world-class field hockey player. She wants to be with her friends and have fun, etc. So it's got to be fun. No matter what you do, 2/3 of kids tell us all the drivers for their decisions are fun. And that's social networks, fun places to be, people I like to be around, cool things to do, things I can brag about, like playing in the Ontario Summer Games or something. All that's encapsulated in fun, right? It's not about those high things. So all those things I kind of talking about. Another important one, I keep saying that every time, I know. Time poverty. So this is the same study. That notion, this is more for the older people in the crowd like me, that notion that people are bored, just drop it. No one is ever bored anymore. Like this Friday night, every one of you in this room made a decision to come here at the expense of, at the very least, doing your favorite online digital thing that you like to do. So that's your new baseline, right? I remember being a kid just sitting at home waiting for something to do. That's gone. And so this is the data from those kids. Like they're doing more things than they're awake every week. I mentioned this. You're in a great spot. You're one of the few sports that are growing. All I can tell you is stay there. Don't get more expensive. Don't get more restrictive. Don't spot things. Here's another neat thing from a business perspective that some of you can think about, is when this neat notion, and take this from a triathlete who missed this and never thought this could happen. All of these founders of these organizations have made not tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. So there's this new thing of the businessification of participation sport. And I talked a bit about that earlier. So if you've got a high level of participants, no TV, no Olympics, no World Cup, there are business opportunities. And don't miss out on those because these people have done really, really well. Data analytics, I just throwing that up there because it's a big thing. There's tons of data out there now. Challenging to get what to use with it. All I'll tell you for this one is that brands care about it. And if you have data on people that are your members, your customers, it'll make that stuff a lot easier for you. For those of you that can sell tickets, we're in this wonderful world of the secondary market where now anybody can go to any game. So used to be you could never go to the Wimbledon final or the World Cup final. Now it's just how much do you want to spend on it. So if you've got anything you sell tickets to, try to create some demand and build a secondary market. And the last thing I'll say with the 12 is, I'm doing good, is proliferation of content. So I love the stat that anyone like any of us each day gets hit with between 3,000 and 5,000 images. So if you think that your tweet or your message or your signage board is resonating with lots of people, it's not. It's just really, really, really hard to get across. So keep that in mind when you're planning your stuff. So hopefully that's helpful. Those are just 12 of my kind of thoughts of things to think about. So hopefully, Johnny, that hit the mark. So the last thing I want to talk about, the last 3 topics are all related to this new study we just did. And this is really, really cool stuff. So what we decided to do, and there's Adam again, because he's my partner on this. We decided to go out and figure out what's happening in sport around the world. So we've done 11 countries, and there's 7 more that are coming. And so IMI drove a lot of this data collection and what we kind of wanted to do. So general population, multiple countries. I'll talk about that in a second. So here's what the sample we had. So we had Colombia and Argentina, Canada, the US, India and China, and the 5 European countries. If you know your soccer or football, which some of you do, you'll recognize those are the 5 countries that have a major Premier League, the major Premier Leagues. So we ruled out a few populations that don't have any access to technology or the ability to do stuff. And so we estimate that the sample is from an overall population of about 2.4 billion people in the world. So pretty cool from those 11 countries. Between 13 and 64, which in most developed countries is somewhere around 2/3 of the living population. So keep that in mind. Not people over 65 and not young children. We asked a bunch of questions I won't spend too much time on this. You know how they act, how they believe in things. Is it impacting them in different kind of ways? We used a very simple metric. So keep in mind, this is very simple. So engagement was like, have you done any of these things at least once in the last 12 months for that sport or that activity? So we talked a lot about it, but it's challenging, so we just kept it very, very simple. So keep that with a grain of salt as we kind of go forward. There's the different questions there's multiple questions that we kind of asked, and I'll talk about these things. I think they're pretty intuitive, whether you'd want to purchase, whether you feel that sport's got momentum, whether you have passion for it. They're pretty straightforward. We wanted to add this into just to kind of start, and this is from another project we've done, but this is just to show that there is some really good stories for organizations like you if a sport grows overall. So here's two examples of not-for-profit organizations, the NCAA and the IOC, and this is how much money they share with all of their organizations, right? So one of the things we often criticize FIFA would be the same boat, but at the end of the day, if they're managed properly, these organizations share huge amounts of money with their membership. There's no owners. If the NFL, which they do, makes an extra few $1 billion a year, Robert Kraft gets another yacht kind of thing, right? So we've got this dynamic, which is really nice. So we wanted to kind of reemphasize that. So here's the population. So about 54% of that 2.4 billion. So keep that 2.4 in mind, because that's the population all the way through for the remaining slides. And so of that group, here's how many do sport. Well, you'd say, well, China's got more. We only considered the parts of China or India that were developed enough where people were kind of living a Western-style lifestyle, which is getting to be most of the country now. You can see those numbers. 19. On average, those 1.3 billion people are engaging in 19 sports every year. This is really interesting, and you think about watching it on television, it's supporting that notion that people are fans of sport. Now, clearly you might watch one or the other, but think about it yourself for a second. Take the last calendar year and think, how many sports have you gambled on, watched on television, played at least once? You probably get to a number like that, or quite a bit higher pretty quickly. So people are engaged. So the nice thing is it's easier to get somebody more engaged if they already are. Now, when we talk about who's engaged the most, India clearly was the lowest level. This line here is anybody that was above 50%, and this line was above 75%, and that's kind of the averages. So the South American countries were the highest, and one of the factors we thought about there was they just hosted the Pan Am Games and the Tour de France near those countries. The European countries kind of clustered next, which have the big Premier League clubs, and then we've always got our NHL, Canada, NFL in the US. When we talk about generations, and so this is kind of interesting, when you flip back to what I was just talking about, the goldfish, right? Also known as Gen Z or Next Gen. They are by far the most engaged generation in sport. And the reason is they do a lot of stuff. They're also younger, but they also do a lot of sport-based video games, right? A lot of esports, FIFA, etc., that they kind of play. And so that's an interesting thing. The boomers in the US is kind of an interesting one that kind of pops up here. We also asked them, what other types of things are you engaged with? So here's another idea, and we talked about this, is that it's almost the same as things like festivals, art museums, wine tastings, are about the same proportion of the population, and in fact, the same people. They're also people that donate to causes. They're also people that engage in music. So you start thinking about that broader engagement dynamic overall, and it's the same metric. Did you go to one music concert in the last year? You'd check here. If you went to 56, you're still just checked once, right? Here we get into the other kind of thing. So this is the sport ones, but here's any entertainment and lifestyle property. Very similar. Spain came up a little bit, but you still see Colombia and Argentina near the top, then the European and North American countries further down, and then India at the bottom, the UK as well. We asked about global interest in these properties. This would be the estimated number out of that 2.4 billion, so this is hundreds of millions of people that are engaged in these kind of things. So pride festivals, do a marathon, wine tasting, huge numbers supporting a lot of these different products or these offerings as well. This is from a different study that we did about, and this is something we had to work a lot at. So I did this with my colleagues at Stanford, and we had to really come up with an interesting metric, but these are the most popular sports in the world, right? So soccer, number one by a mile, cricket, basketball, field hockey, tennis. Some of these kind of surprise you, right? Volleyball, table tennis, largely driven by China. Baseball, football, rugby, we did them together. And then golf. So this is where you'll probably find this very interesting. So in terms of the actual sport property that had the highest level of engagement, you're probably not surprised to see those two at the top, FIFA and the IOC. But what's interesting is how close the other ones are. So you're talking about like the International Paralympic Committee has more than 90% of the people of the total number of the International Olympic Committee. And you see like the US Open, Wimbledon at 1 billion people. Roland Garros, French Open at almost 1 billion people. The Tour de France across the board. So if we look at that, we see, well, this is interesting. So that movement is working together. Here's the soccer numbers, right? So you've got FIFA, in the major Premier Leagues, Champions League, Euro, all in that top 20. We've got these events, as you know, are really influential. How do you develop more Grand Slams, right? Tennis and golf, really, really powerful. Here's some ones. Let me go back. These are ones that are not in the top 20 that are a little bit less, but you think about, these are in the top 20 with different properties. So here's our first esports one. So League of Legends, and that sample is 880 million fans, esports. Here's ones that were just below that I kind of just talked a bit ahead of. So La Liga was just below, UFC, WWE, wrestling, and I'll show you a slide in a second that'll blow your mind. Wrestling has just made a massive renaissance. It's doing brilliantly. MLS, we heard that in the coffee time chat earlier, really good. And some of the women's sports coming up really nicely. In terms of domestic, so if we look at India versus China, this is quite interesting, how you'll see very different sports. The only thing in common is the Tokyo 2020 Olympic Games. You see the Premier League in China and FIFA in India, which is kind of interesting. The India, obviously cricket is over here and table tennis is over here. And so there's really interesting mixes, and then maybe the British Heritage and the Wimbledon on that side. So as you'd expect, the major North American properties have recognized these markets, and they're trying to get in there. Europe. So I'm going to now dig into each of some of the continental groups together. So here's the 5 European countries, and you can see their top 5 properties. So in England, you'll see Wimbledon at the top. Champions League shows up quite a bit, and I'll do a breakdown in a second across the board, but very similar, a mix of different stuff. One thing that's quite interesting is Roland Garros, so the French Open is in Spain, but not in the France list, and we could probably thank the guy that's won it, 13 times, Nadal, for that one. So you get some really interesting pieces that are across, very similar in Europe. Here are the soccer or football ones. So you can see England, 4 of the 5, but across the board in those countries, as you'd expect, very, very dominant in terms of football. When we look at the different football leagues versus clubs, and this is unique to your sport, absolutely unique. You would never see where clubs have the same level of following, if not more following, than the actual league. And I'm sure you can guess where that is. But here's the club level data, and here's the leagues of the 5 Premier Leagues above. You will notice that the 2 that are higher are in La Liga. So the 2 big clubs in La Liga, which you all know, have more followers than the league itself, which you could never imagine in a North American context. So I'm going to go through these ones now. So this is going to show you some interesting stuff of that league versus club. So this now takes us for that engagement down the list. So the engagement, as I said before, was do you have 1 or more person involved? Then this gets into how intense is that relationship. Do you feel that sport's got momentum? Do you have passion for it? And this is one where you've actually purchased something related to it. So this is the number at the bottom that organizations, businesses, sport businesses really care about. And so you can see La Liga below the 2 clubs. It kind of holds pretty steady down the list. If we go to South America, we find we only had 2 countries, right? Colombia and Argentina. But we can see this one, we see the powerful effect of recency. So Lima, Peru had just held the Pan American Games, and the Tour de France had its first ever Colombian champion. For those that follow, here he is. And so you can see this huge impact that it had on driving the Tour de France to their most engaged property. Cycling is obviously big, but Egan Bernal won the Tour de France just before we kind of collected the data. North America is very different than the other two. We don't see soccer as dominant as a context, as you all know. And so here's the US versus Canada, NFL and NHL being the dominant properties. You see the Olympics in both. You see the NCAA is very popular in the US, and then some similarities across the board. For us, we see the US Open, interestingly, and we'll talk about Bianca in a second. The NBA, MLS at number 10, which is a pretty good result. Rogers Cup, CFL. Here at the US, I'm going to go these quickly. Very clearly, football is dominant, but it's also very regional. In the South, the NFL is dominant, but then you can see where the NCAA falls. In Canada, the CFL, even though the CFL ended up number 7, it's got really, really strong regional power. So Ontario, as we know, struggles with CFL in terms of large, and same with Quebec. But out west, it's the number 2 or number 3 property when we look at it across the board. Quick little stuff on sponsorship, and I just kept this in. I was going to take it out, but kept it in because it really backs up what we just said about Canadian context earlier. It's the same dynamic around the world. Sponsorship of sport properties works, right? It gets people buying, following, clicking, testing, trialing, etc. We measured it based, are they likely to purchase, or do they express some brand love? So they're an advocate, they have increased trust, they pass things around that particular way. And that funnel, so that's this group that leads down here. Did you buy? Did you show some kind of love? So here's our number 1 property. So of those 1.1 billion that consumed the Olympics at least once, 437 million are investing, buying a sponsored product, etc., of that group overall, which is a pretty powerful number going forward. If we go to the top 4, the World Cup, FIFA World Cup, you can see is lower here, but has a higher impact on actual purchase. So much stronger level as you go down, and that might be related to its additional properties and its scope and its reach, etc., not just limited to the Olympics every other year. The NBA, and then League of Legends. So we just wanted to show this one. So esports is really interesting. Lower at all the top, really low in momentum. So the people that respond, that play, they say, well, I don't know how esports, maybe the game will disappear. But holy cow, am I going to support anyone that sponsors it or plays in it, or I'm going to invest in the athletes that do well? Really, really strong. So esports has got that get your money out of your pocket kind of dynamic going on that a lot of the other sports don't. Here's some of the strongest overall engagement. So we can, again, talk about the 2 big ones. So that overall engagement that I just said, the intensity much higher, NBA and League of Legends. Momentum, pretty similar, except for that esports way below. Passion, pretty similar. And then we see this kind of, they're all similar, but interesting, the 2 that come up higher in terms of purchases overall. How do you get people to kind of want to do this? So we ask people to kind of do those, like provide some open-ended word questions. And so when people are at an event, here's what they tell us. So some people are bored. That might be the older people. But then the people are excited. They're amused. They have pride. They're competitive. But then this is what's really good. When you think about just signage versus the impact of some kind of activation, it has a massive impact on how aware these people are across these 11 countries and what they kind of want to do. A little deep thing into just a couple of slides on the athletes. So athletes in this study we asked about as well. I think it's important for us to think about their power. So in the big leagues, athletes command a lot of the money. We got these 2 guys we know are doing extremely well and how much they're making every year. Well, how much do they do for their sponsors? Again, this is across these massive 2.4 billion marketplace. So here's Ronaldo. So you can see awareness is pretty high. There's some people in the US who don't know who he is. 70% of Americans don't know who Messi is, which is interesting. But you've got these kind of lists across the board. And then interested, but look down here. I support brands they partner with. 12 out of 100, 26 out of 100. China and India, almost a third. That's massive power. No wonder they make so much money, right? And then you've got 17, 27, and 33 for Messi. So these guys track at a really high level. You saw when his jersey sales. That was just extraordinary. And I mentioned her before, Bianca. This is amazing. So, you know, this young lady that won the US Open from Canada. So we had this data. Fortunately, we were collecting at the same time. We had it before. And you can see aware of who she is, Canadians, interested in her, follow them, support their brands. Look at the percentage jumps right after she won the US Open. So if you ever get an athlete that clicks on something like this, jump over. And here's some of the names she was behind in terms of sponsor support, and she jumped ahead with that win. So you can see her celebrity status just went absolutely through the roof. Here's another one we like to talk about. So athletes, back to the cause thing. So you may remember the J.J. Watt, his efforts. So he was able, with just a little association, to help raise $37 million for relief in Houston in 20 days. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about is where is sport headed. So this is momentum variable. Very, very positive. So the respondents in all the countries are really, really hot on sport. There's a few that say it's going to go backwards, but generally very, very big. Where does this come from? And so the first one is European football. And so you saw that the massive followings from all these kind of groups, this is momentum. This is people that believe these sports are on the rise and they're growing and they're going to do great things and they love them and they're excited about them. It's a very strong metric, and you can see that across the board. Second one, it's an interesting one, was Formula E. So this is largely driven by Europe, but Formula E started very poorly. This is Formula One where they've got electric cars, right? So there's no noise. So people didn't like that at first, but now a bunch of celebrities have gotten behind it. The whole the environmental movement's picking up, and it's just a hair behind Formula One, which is a major, major sport in terms of what we're seeing. So environmentalism really showing some positive stuff. Here's the wrestling stuff. So those that believe in wrestling is just it's not real. This is what we're seeing. So WWE, but all of these other brands are also popping up. So there's startups, there's entrepreneurs, there's new countries, there's buying, there's ventures going on. It's absolutely exploding, this mix of soap opera and sport. Cricket. So cricket we've always known as big in India and Australia, et cetera. Well, the ICC, the International Cricket Council, has finally gotten its act together, and they've figured out how to work together, and they've targeted being in the Olympic Games in 2028. So they're growing the number of countries. They're building what they want to do. They want to drive everything. So keep your eyes on cricket. Like what happened with rugby, if it hits the Olympic Games, it could be a competitor for people like rugby is with you. Women's sport. So we've had so many negative things with women's sport. Recently, the failed Professional Women's Hockey League. The data showed us something very different and showed us that the momentum is there. It's maybe just a matter of time and market adoptions and women actually starting to support women's sport and a number of these notions that are out there. But the WTA and the WNBA and FIFA Women's all had really, really positive momentum scores from those 11 countries of population. Esports, I've mentioned it before. I've talked about League of Legends as the big one, but the whole gang, all of the major ones that came across, all have positive momentum, all are growing, hundreds of millions of fans around the world in those countries. It's real, it's here, it's extraordinarily big from what we're kind of seeing. Here's the number of esports engagement across the nation, really, really big in South America, where you can see those numbers are very, very big. Participation. So we've had this ongoing kind of back and forth of what's going to drive participation. So you can see the largely, driven by people that participate, not necessarily with teams, running, swimming, and biking are at the top. But then our major sports are all kind of in here. And compare those numbers to what we showed earlier of the number that are engaged, right? The NBA is at 1 billion. Well, 417 million at least played basketball once in the last year. So there's some positive kind of results in there. And there's soccer right there. So more people played basketball than soccer, which is kind of interesting. All right, so that's the content I wanted to share, and I'm literally at 56 minutes, so I feel like I'm doing well. So 3 slides just to kind of summarize. One, this is kind of the summary of the IMI data. And the whole point, I think, and why we wanted to share it, and I know a lot of it is above your day-to-day, but these trends are massive, and you got to think about what's coming digitally and women's sport, and where the competitors are coming from, what kind of things young people care about. And that was all come across the board. Sport is doing really, really, really well globally as we kind of look at those kind of stuff. Lots and lots of options coming up and people choosing to spend time with alternative things like festivals and music and food and wine and these kind of things. The big properties are dominating, which makes it smaller for the rest of us. The differences regionally, particularly in our sport and others, is very, very profound. Big opportunities coming in the developed world, and as we add more countries to this, that will continue to grow. Women's sports, soccer, racing, esports, cricket, and wrestling, the ones at the end, keep your eye on those as we kind of go forward. So back to the recruitment and retention piece. Here's the kind of takeaways I would try to share and I think are important. If you're thinking about any athletes, any volunteers, anybody, especially young people, make it fun, make it social, make it flexible, encourage friendships, encourage positive places to be. Try to integrate, not dissuade, video and digital. Try to integrate. Now that's hard for a lot of people to wrap their head around, but try to make it part of what you do. Get your team to have a skin in FIFA so they can go play on the weekends with their teammates. Like, engage this kind of stuff, right? It's really hard to do. Allow them to do it. Understand this target, their attention span, what they're interested in, how they think. A lot of people think millennials are lazy. They're not lazy. They just need to be engaged in extraordinary multitaskers, right? Take advantage of those kind of positivities. Try to become more cohesive as a sport. This is one thing I talked to a few people about this, but he's like all the different ways you can enter into soccer, and I've been experiencing it now as a volunteer parent team manager, the way the clubs compete against each other and which league you play in. I don't know, maybe find a way to make it a little easier for people and remove a lot of those barriers to participation as you kind of go forward. Make it easy, make it fun, make it digital, make it cool, and you'll have kids and you'll stay a growing sport for a very long time. And for sponsorship, back where we started off, so generating those additional resources going forward. The big advantage you guys have in this room is two things. One, you're local, which you saw Canadian brands now want, and you have huge opportunities and not the inability to not allow them to do experiential stuff. They can get in there, they can talk to people, they can do things, they can trial stuff. Really, really interesting. And as I mentioned with that group of 5 things across, build different strategies. So if you're trying to do a fundraising campaign, don't call those people sponsors. If someone gives you a $1,000 check and asks for nothing in return, they're not a sponsor, right? Think about these things in different ways and have different approaches for all those things. And if you're of the size or interest, think about that PPP that I talked about. And then you saw this throughout all the data we support, is you've got to give sponsors a chance to do stuff, get product out, just like Bjorn does with this particular conference, right? All right, that was an hour. So hopefully that was okay. And I don't know if there's time for questions, but I would take them.